I think it's amazing. I don't know if you know Steve Salhani or not. He's like the boss in Spider-Man who yells at Peter Parker, "Parker, get out of here!" But the guy has an incredible heart, and there were multiple times over those years where you knew it was for real. Like, he actually cared about me. Like, we went through a really tough time. I lost a baby with my wife Jess, and like the care that he specifically, and Mark Hannon, there was real relationship there, and they knew that if they let me do the show, it was going to be fine. And so, I bring that up for a reason, because I think a lot of times relationship is lost in a lot of companies where these are just people who are employees and no one really cares. And so I think you're seeing the fruit of no one really caring in a lot of different spaces in the industry right now. And if that changed, if people actually cared, I think the industry would look totally different.
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
In this episode, we are diving into the story of someone whose journey in radio began with a pair of headphones and a love for morning talk shows. Growing up in Hillsdale, New Jersey, he discovered the magic of radio as a 13-year-old, sparking a passion that shaped his future. By high school, he was already volunteering at a station, learning the ropes and falling in love with the craft. From answering phones to producing and eventually co-hosting on one of the biggest nationally syndicated shows in the country, he worked his way up in the industry. In 2013, he took a leap to host his own show in Boston, bringing his signature style to the airwaves. Beyond the mic, he's a family man. He's happily married to his wife, Jess, and they are jointly raising 3 daughters alongside their 2 beloved dogs, Luna and Frankie. I love that you guys are dog parents, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Get ready to meet the voice behind it all. Welcome to TJ. TJ, welcome to the show, man.
Chachi, thanks so much for having me. First of all, I'm a super fan of yours. I've listened to many of the episodes that you put out, and you're so good at this, and I feel like the industry needs what you're doing right here, so keep up the amazing work, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this.
You made my day. Thank you, TJ. It's very, very kind of you to say. And
it's true.
I'm so excited. One thing I did not say in the intro, but TJ's syndicated now in over 75 radio stations around the country. And we're going to get into all of that, all the way into now New York City, by the way. I am watching your career take off. It feels like, from my perspective, like this rocket ship. I know there's a lot that has gone into it. And we're going to go through that whole entire career journey, but I did want to mention that before we dive in. So if you are interested in syndication, which I know a lot of people are, you definitely want to listen to this episode. TJ, tell me a little bit about growing up in New Jersey.
So my dad is a contractor and my mom is a social worker. And I grew up just as this kid who went to school and wasn't great at it. And I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. And one day I discovered the radio and I became glued to it. For some reason, I was so drawn to listening to this radio every single day. And it wasn't just listening, it was an obsession. Like, I would get up early rather than getting, as much sleep as I could. I'd get up early, turn the radio on, listen as long as I could. I'd throw a cassette tape in the recorder. I'd run off to school with my headphones on, listening to the show. Then I'd run home, catch the rest of the tape. And that became my life from like 13 on.
What stations were you listening to and what personalities?
So I only thought the radio was sports and politics, and that's what my dad would listen to in the garage. And I saw Howard Stern's Private Parts movie, and I wasn't watching it for the radio side of things. I found it on the coffee table in one of my friend's basements, and we turned it on, and I found myself cracking up from the first scene, and that made me find him on K-Rock. And then I learned about what it's like to joke around for a living and connect with people. And it really felt like a friend group that I'd tune into every single day. So I was mostly Howard.
It's an incredible talent. I mean, to grow up, and you're listening primarily in New Jersey to New York stations. Do you also get some Philly stations there as well?
No, I was all the way up in North Jersey. So we were right near the George Washington Bridge.
Okay, got it. So you're getting a lot of New York State. I mean, it's such an incredible radio market. So at that time, you've got Scott Shannon on the air, mm-hmm. Howard on the air, Imus, I'm sure, was on the air at that time. Jim Kerr, of course. I mean, just it's mega talents.
Yeah, my mom would listen to Jim Kerr in the car. She'd listen to Scott Shannon, and I'd get that when I was in the car with her.
So you got the full, and then also news talk at that young of an age. You were interested in that as well?
I didn't know what was going on in the world at all. Even the radio couldn't help me on that. I was so plugged into entertainment at that time.
Got it. And so the things that Howard was saying were obviously very funny. And at that time, that was the beginning, or somewhat the beginning of Howard Stern. You're a little bit younger than I am, but he was very different than what he is today. And I remember I grew up out in the desert, but I used to get Howard here on 97.1. I could listen to it out in the desert, and he would say he still does, but not like what he used to. Some really crazy things. It was a shock jock.
Totally. I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know entertainment talk was a thing until I found that show.
And are your parents at this point, are you thinking about this? Are your parents okay that you're listening to Howard, or were they a little bit like, hey, this is okay?
No, my dad was a really big fan. And then when I saw the movie, I asked him, I said, hey, what station is he on? And he said, I'm not telling you that. And so the next morning I woke up and just turned the dial all the way to the left, and then one click at a time listened for the show, and I found it. And he was like, he woke up the next morning. He's like, are you kidding me? And then he walked out. No, they weren't thrilled, but they let me do my own thing.
At this point, do you know that you want to pursue a career in radio, or you're just thinking of it as, hey, Howard's really funny and this is entertaining?
Yeah, it was all entertainment. And I think by the time I was about 15 years old, my dad asked me to assist him on a job. And I learned what it was like to be a contractor over that summer. And I was like, this is really hard work. And the only thing that felt like a break was turning the radio on. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Well, I got to lift windows and move things around. But if I'm listening to the radio, it's not that bad. And then at some point, I was like, I wonder if I could do this. I didn't have any connection to the industry. But I just made a bunch of phone calls and asked a lot of questions, and someone encouraged me to call all the local college radio stations in our area, and I did, and no one got back to me. And there was one that eventually called me back and said, hey, you could use a board op on Sunday mornings. Would you be willing to come in? And so I'm this high school kid. I go to get interviewed at this college radio station. It was WFDU in Teaneck, New Jersey, and they gave me an opportunity to come in and learn how the board works.
So what did you do at FDU?
So they let me into their space, and it was a real radio station with real equipment. And my earliest memory is learning how the faders work. And then there was this old Roland editor that had about 4 tracks on it. Yeah. And the guy who ran it, his name is Duff Sheffield. He sat me down and he showed me, he's like, you get one undo. If you mess it up, you got to scrap the whole session. And so I learned how to edit. It was basically like a digital reel-to-reel tape. And that took up most of my time. It was that. And then eventually I started getting air shifts. They'd give me a shift if there was like an overnight that was open, or there was an opportunity to come in and fill in for someone last minute. And I spent every possible minute that I could at that radio station. And it totally changed my life.
What a tremendous opportunity to be able to start working as a high school student at a college station, and to have mentors like that to show you that. And by the way, that technology, lack of technology at the time, it was state of the art, but I think makes people a much better producer, because you are limited in being able to go back and make edits, or you've got to basically start from scratch. So I think nowadays, sometimes we tend to get spoiled with undo, and we can now even, go back multiple steps. It's just such a different world today in terms of editing and production.
Yeah. And that production foundation, it's hard. Sometimes I don't know if I'm an on-air host or a producer because I love the production side of it so much. And that was the foundation of it. I'm in Pro Tools every single day. I love learning more about Pro Tools. I'm obsessed with that just as much as I am the on-air side.
I would argue that makes you a phenomenal on-air host. And I've listened to your show, and you guys do such a great job of incorporating produced elements. And I love some of your parodies that you do. I find them absolutely hysterical. I think you guys do a really good job with your production. And I honestly, in some ways, it's a bit of a lost art. And I don't blame people for doing less of it now, just because I think they've got less time. And so you can't put together some of the bits that we used to do back in the day at, a lot of morning shows, because they just don't have the resources they once did. But you guys still do that, and I find it, candidly, very entertaining.
Well, thank you for that. It is a group effort, but the amount of time that I could spend in Pro Tools and feel like the time has just evaporated. Like I still get that feeling where I could open the program And I'm in there for 2 hours and it feels like 10 minutes have passed. And I don't know why I like it so much, but I just love moving around audio and putting pieces that don't normally go together to make something that's greater.
Well, you're an artist, and a lot of times artists get lost in their work. And the next thing you know, it takes you 4 years to paint the Sistine Chapel.
It's fun though. I do love the new technology, and I prefer it over the Roland.
I get that, but there is still something about charming and romantic about the older technology.
Totally.
So you go and you graduate, and then you actually do a year of school at FDU, and I assume the entire time you're working at the station there. And then you get an opportunity now to phone op at Z100. Do you realize at this point just what a big deal Z100 is, and that it's the most listened to CHR station on the planet, or at least in the United States?
No, I never admitted this because I was so embarrassed by it, but it's actually even more wild than what you just described. So I was a junior and a senior in high school, and it was my senior year of high school that Z100 left a message at this radio station. They were soliciting a bunch of radio stations, and my mentor said, hey, we got this phone call from Z100. It was David Brody, the executive producer at the time, and they're looking for interns. And I looked at him and I said, well, do you think I should do that though? Like, would that be a good move? And he was like, are you kidding me? He's like, this is the biggest radio station on the planet. I said, okay, well, I guess I'll go in for an interview. And I went in for an interview, and they gave me a tour of the place, and it was like, I fell in love. It was dreamland. And, I started to do my homework on the show, and I was like, oh my goodness, Elvis is an amazing host. And I just got to know everyone, and I was like, I want to be here. I don't know how I'm going to get in the door here, but I want to get here. And I just kept calling him over and over and over again. So I'm in high school calling Z100 saying, all right, let me know how the interview went. And, looking back on it, it's wild that it happened that way. But I did realize what a big deal it was when I went into the building for the first time. And by the grace of God, I got the opportunity, and I was one of 5 interns in the summer before my freshman year of college. So I was just out of high school, and because I was in with the fabric of WFDU, they knew I was going to go there. And the head of the broadcasting department, who was my mentor at that station, signed off on the paperwork and said, all right, you're an intern.
Amazing. Now, are they still, at that point, is Z100 still in Jersey, or are they now in New York, in the city?
No, they were in Jersey City. And
in Jersey City.
Yeah. So I show up for the interview an hour and a half late because I had never, and it was a total accident. I didn't know how to drive out of my little town that I lived in. I only would drive from my parents' driveway to my high school. I'd never driven into a city for any reason. So I'm on Route 3, and I had no idea. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't know how to get to Jersey City. And I'm trying, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm going to blow my opportunity. I remember I pulled over at a Toys R Us, and I went into the front of the customer service area, and I said, hey, I'm trying to get to Jersey City, and I have no idea. How do I even get there? And she pointed in a direction. And she said, just don't go through the Lincoln Tunnel. Just make sure you turn here. And again, like I get a phone call from David Brody, and he's like, hey, where are you? I know we have an interview. I'm like, I'm really sorry. I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get there. And he starts navigating me to Jersey City, telling me, all right, you're on Marin Boulevard, make a right there. And it was just like, there was so much grace. It's hard to believe looking back on it.
This is all now coming together. So I just saw David in New York, and what an incredible talent. So David's producing the show at this point, and then you're still obviously at FDU, but how did you meet David?
Well, so it was either him or one of his assistants was calling the stations and leaving messages.
Got it. You returned.
They were looking to put together an internship program.
Okay, totally understand now. When you mentioned he was a mentor, I thought maybe you had met him first at FDU, but okay, completely makes sense. So you're going in for the first time at this point to meet David in person. And then are you also meeting with Elvis? And another question, really? Okay, so now just say David at this point.
Yeah, it was all Brody, and we had a great conversation, and then I never heard from him. And I was like, uh-oh, well, I guess I messed it up. Maybe it was the fact that I was late, or that's when I just started hounding him. I just, every day, leaving messages. And he finally called me back, and he was like, you're very persistent, But, and normally we don't give an opportunity to someone who's right out of high school, but it seems like you're qualified based on what I'm seeing here and the work that you submitted. So you've got the internship.
Oh, that's awesome. And at that point, you now know, though, kind of the magnitude after going there to Z100 and what a big deal. And what was that feeling like just to be able to get your foot in the door at, such a legendary CHR station and to kind of paint that picture, because you had obviously, Elvis doing mornings, but was Pullman at the PD at that point?
Yeah, he was.
Jeez, man. So you've got Tom Pullman, who's world-renowned program director. You're working with David, amazing producer, Elvis, of course. And I mean, that's just a remarkable opportunity. So what was your day-to-day once you got that internship?
I just said, I'll do anything you want. Just tell me what you need, and I'll do anything I can. I knew how to edit. So I think one of the biggest advantages that I had was, so shortly after I had my first internship, I got a second and then a third semester of an internship. And I think it was during the third semester or right after it, there was a phone op job that went up, and it was like $5.15 an hour. And I said, can I apply for this? And they all knew me there at the station, everyone in the hallways, and they hired me for the gig. And because I had access to the radio station, I would come in on Saturdays to answer the phones on the request lines. And then as soon as that shift would end around 2 p.m, all of my friends from high school were all going to college in different areas. So I had no friends, and I just stayed at the radio station. I asked permission. I said, hey, do you mind if I get some work done? And what I started doing was I would edit best ofs, and I would do all of this tedious work. And I loved doing it. I would edit promos, and then Monday morning, they'd be sitting there waiting for Brody and Scary to listen through, and it was helpful. And so at some point, I think over time, it was like, okay, well, this is actually helping our workflow. That eventually led to Elvis hiring me.
It's a really fascinating story I'm going to share here, and it has to do with who you are. I was on my way home from New York, and I watched a Mark Cuban masterclass, and Mark Cuban's talking about what he's looking for in people when he goes to make an investment. And he said the number one thing is that they are all in. That a lot of people, and I think younger people particularly, don't have the same understanding of what it takes to succeed and what being all in means. And I get that a lot of people want the work-life balance and the whole deal, but his point is, man, when you are early in your career, it is absolutely going to be life-changing, and you have to be all in. And you were all in. You were literally staying past your shift, and were there literally just taking it in and doing whatever you possibly could to learn and succeed in the business.
Yeah, and it was also awkward because everyone's like, what are you doing here so late? And it was sort of like, they were laughing about it, but at the same time, like, is this guy, like, is he okay? He's just here all the time. I remember on Saturday night at that time, Sharon Daster, who eventually became the PD, and Danielle Monero hosted the pajama party. And, it'd be this big joke, like, you're still here, and I'm like, and then I would just try to, like, hide so they didn't notice me, because I was so, like, it was awkward. Like, I didn't do anything other than just hang out at the radio station. But again, everyone was so graceful about it, and it was helping the show, so it was fine.
And at this point, you're still not sure, do you want to be a producer? Do you want to be on air? Do you want to program? You're just kind of still taking it all in and seeing how things unfold, essentially.
No, I started to realize that I did want to be on the air. The problem was I just assumed, because I had zero confidence, Chachi, when I came into this building. I didn't believe in myself. I just had a lot of weird struggles that I had to work out. And at some point, Elvis sat me down and he said, well, what is it that you want to do? You're doing so many things at the radio station here. What do you want to do? And I just had this push of confidence to say, well, I really want to do what you do. And I would love to host a show if I could. And he didn't skip a beat. And like in that moment, it was a divine intervention. I'm convinced of it. He said, you could totally do that. And here's why. And he started listing the reasons why he felt I could be a host of a show. And from that moment on, I thought, okay, well, if he believes in me to be able to do that, then I'm going to just keep working towards that. And I am convinced that moment changed my life.
that you couldn't get a better endorsement. That's like Phil Jackson saying, hey, I think you can be a basketball player. I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than that. That's really says a lot about Elvis too, because I think a lot of talent would be defensive and go, oh, and the fact that he brought that out of you and nurtured you and helped you along the way is really a testament to him as a human being. So when that moment happens, how does your mindset change in terms of now you're more focused on being on the air? What is your day-to-day? How does that shift?
Yeah, I still wanted to be extremely respectful of the fact that I was hired to do a job, and I wanted to do a great job at it, and I wanted to over-deliver on what I was supposed to be doing every day. But anytime there was an opportunity to do anything related to on the air, or I would offer myself up for swing shifts, or if somebody was out last minute, hey, I'll be available. And so there were times where last minute, maybe somebody might get sick or whatever. And if it meant getting to the radio station at 2 a.m. to host the 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. slot before the morning show started, I was down. I was ready to go. If it meant on the weekends coming in, if it meant on Saturday night, if it meant an overnight into Sunday, if it meant running the board on Sunday morning, whatever opportunity there was, I just wanted everyone to know that I'm available and I'll make it work. I'll figure out a way to get in there.
And then you become a full-time assistant producer, and that's a big deal. I was, essentially a full-time assistant producer for Rick Dees. And when you're working at that level and the pressure, especially in that era that went along with that gig, fill everyone in a little bit on what day-to-day was in terms of what you were doing for Elvis, what you were doing for David, and that producer position. And I'm in really quickly, I am a firm believer that so many assistant producers go on to do, or I should say, not even assistant producers, but producers in general, go on to be incredible talent because they understand the fundamentals of a morning show more so than just about anyone. And, perfect is Bert, who was obviously a producer for Kid Craddock for many years. You, who produced for Elvis. I mean, so many, not a ton because it's a very difficult job, but I would bet that the odds of going on for success after being a producer is exponentially better than if someone who never was a producer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I couldn't have planned for that, but you're totally spot on. I think the production foundation is essential. Like you were saying earlier, it makes such a huge difference when you're on the air. You're editing in your head, and you also know every layer of what needs to happen on the production front. But to answer your question, what was the day-to-day? It was the promos and doing best ofs and all that stuff that I was working on those Saturdays. So I kept doing that. And then we were doing bits, and they had the phone tap, and so I would do some of those, and those were the prank calls, and so I'd be in the studio doing a bunch of those as often as I possibly could. And basically whatever capacity that I had to stay awake and be safe on the drive home, I would spend every possible minute at the radio station. So whatever had to get done for that day or the next day's show, cutting up clips from television or things that were floating around in the pop culture sphere, all that stuff would be part one of the day. And then anything extra that I can get done, I would stay as late as I had to try to get as much done as possible.
Was this also the same time when David was producing for Elliot, when Elliot went down to D.C. and he was going back and forth between New York and D.C., or was he already full-time in New York at this point?
You know what? I don't know the timeline on that. I know Elliot wasn't there when I came in. I think he had just left.
Okay, yeah. So I think it might have been around the same time because I believe David was actually, reminds me of the Tom Joyner story where Tom was the fly jock going between Dallas and Chicago. David, I believe, was going back and forth for a while working on both shows. And he would be down in D.C. for a week or two and then up in New York for a week or two, and was doing that for a bit, which I always thought was a really interesting story.
Well, he's a guy who, what a great model of having stamina. Like, he would just keep going too, and I sort of saw that as the way to be, and I'm very grateful for that because I think, my dad is also a real hard worker, and so I grew up around that, and I saw that, he'd be out super late and do it again the next day, and so I think that was just a part of who I was raised to be, and then also seeing that in the studio with Brody and all those guys, it made a big difference.
So you get elevated now from going basically as an assistant producer, and you add imaging. So you're now imaging the #1 morning show, or certainly one of the biggest morning shows in the country, and the #1 morning show, or at least top 3 in New York. I know sometimes LTW would bounce around and so forth, but I mean, one of the biggest morning shows on the planet, which is...
And just to clarify, so it was for once Elvis got syndicated, then there was this whole other layer of production that was needed. So we would do imaging pieces for the affiliates, or if they needed to produce up promo. So I wasn't doing much of the imaging locally at that point. It was more about getting stuff out there to the affiliates.
That's still a big responsibility, though. You're putting together imaging for the syndicated show. So you've got to be a very talented imaging director. And I look at that honestly as, I mean, there's production skills and being able to write really great bits and putting together crank calls and everything else, which takes a whole skill. Imaging and sound design, in my opinion, is another skill. And then you're also doing content production and helping, a machine like Elvis is going through a tremendous amount of content. And I can speak to when I produced for D's, there was a lot of times where we would create bits and ideas and so forth and write actual prep down, and he would just not like it. And so a lot of stuff would end up just really on the editing room floor, never made it to the air. And so you have to be prepared. And I remember when I got hired here, Roy Loughlin had used the analogy of the old-fashioned trains where you have to jam the coal into the furnace, and you're constantly filling that big, gigantic furnace full of coal so it can heat up the boiler. And that's what producing for a major talent like Elvis requires. And so your mind is never really at ease. You're constantly thinking of, what can we talk about tomorrow on the show?
Yeah, I think that's anyone who does art too. Any version of art, whether it's writing or if you're doing stand-up comedy, whatever it may be, you've got to be intentional about just, all right, I'm always on. And I don't know, I don't know when I get a break. For some reason, my brain just doesn't shut off. It's constantly thinking of what's the next idea? How do I capture this thought? How do I carry around these little tiny notebooks with me. I've got my phone and sort of mix them all together, but we're always sort of fishing for those thoughts.
I find this whole conversation absolutely enthralling. It reminds me so much of when I produced, and I really enjoyed that part. I look back at that part of my life, and it was one of the most enjoyable, and I think candidly helped set things up to where we are today. And I'm really enjoying learning a lot about you, man. And it's all coming together now to me in a lot of ways. Are your parents, are they supportive at this point? Or are they kind of going, what are you doing?
So I had one conversation with my parents when I decided. So I did decide to drop out of college because I was already in the door at Z100. I was working there. I had a job. I didn't want to waste time at school because I'm like, well, if I'm at school, then I can't be at the radio station. And so at some point I had a conversation with my parents. I said, hey, I want to do this full time. And my mom was like, no, you need a backup plan. And she might have been right. I just didn't want to do it. And my dad, who knew how much it cost to go to school, said, that sounds good to me. Sounds like you're doing it already.
Yeah. I've heard a few of the bits with your mom, and I'm excited to talk more about her, but she's hilarious, man.
And they've always been so supportive. Like, one of my greatest memories is when I turned 16 and I just gotten into WFDU. I told my parents, hey, I want a Mackie mixing board. I think it was like a Mackie 1604 or something. And my dad took me to this local music shop. We went to the pro audio section, and my parents got me this mixing board, which was so generous of them. But I played with that thing every single day, and I learned about turning the EQ knobs and what they did to the sound. I recorded a high school band at that time with that board. And I mean, it sounded, I'm sure, horrible listening back to it, but I started to learn, like, okay, you want to turn the bass down when you're miking up the cymbal, and that was all foundational.
Sure. You're getting,
and that was from their support.
Malcolm Gladwell would say, getting your 10,000 hours in.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you had really, really great parents. And the fact that they were as supportive as they were is fantastic, man. And I'm sure a big reason for your success. I know that your mom is still with us because I've heard her in some of the bits. Is your dad still alive?
Yes. Yeah, they're both like going a million miles an hour still.
Oh, that's great.
They're both working, and they don't stop working. Actually, as a matter of fact, I called my dad recently, and I said, hey, Dad, how's it going? And he goes, always working. I said, okay.
Probably what keeps him young.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, and he He is. He's got a lot of energy, and he hangs out with my kids, his grandkids. He's picking them up. He's tossing them around. It's because he's lifting windows every day.
Yeah, good for him, man. That's great. You get up now to be a co-host on the show. How did that all develop, to be with Elvis on air?
Yeah, so again, Elvis's grace. I got an opportunity because I started to get really serious about wanting to do a show, and I was like, all right, how do I do this? And it was around that time that I met Heather Cohen, who is amazing, and we had a long chat in a deli on Long Island, and she was like, well, what do you want to do? And I told her about my dreams, and I just would love to host a radio show. I love this. And it was, I think in 2009 maybe, I got an offer to host a morning show in a small market in Georgia. And went for an interview, and they said, okay, well, we can hire you, and we're fans. And I was like, okay, great. So I thought, well, I should probably talk to Elvis about this first. So we went to a restaurant in Tribeca, and I said, Elvis, I have this opportunity to host a morning show. Is this what I need to do to be able to do a morning show? Do I need to take this job? And he just had a very candid conversation with me. He's like, it looks really easy here because we have a really big staff. If you go there, it's going to be harder. It's going to be a lot more on you. You could do it, but I actually want to extend an invitation for you to be one of the co-hosts on the show if you'd like to take that. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, we've been thinking about this for a little while. And I said, and again, I said, well, what do you think I should do if I want to host a morning show? And he's like, well, I'd probably consider staying here. And he was just being so honest with me, and I believed him, and he was totally right. And so I decided to stay. I thanked the people in Georgia, and I think it was right around that time or shortly after that he introduced me as one of the co-hosts, and I'd been doing stuff on the air, so it wasn't like a cold intro to the audience. But again, hard to believe. It's very surreal.
It had to have been an outer-body experience to have now Elvis anoint you a co-host of the show. I mean, most people would be a pinnacle of their career, and we're going to get into where you've now taken that. But what an exciting opportunity! And you're still very young at this point. You're, what is that, late 20s? I'm guessing, something like that.
Yeah. I think I guess it was 25 or 26 at that time.
I mean, what a amazing opportunity. And in to the point of, and that Georgia path is honestly how most people would go. The fact that you went from college, to College Station to Z100, now worked your way up within Z100, but still that is, basically getting your first baseball gig as a Dodger or a Yankee. And that does not happen very often, but it also speaks to your ability and the talent that Elvis and David and so many others, Tom Pullman, saw in you.
I'm so grateful for it. If it wasn't for those guys, I would not have been able to work in this line of work for so long. And they really built up this solid foundation and gave me incredible opportunities that at the time just felt normal. But looking back on it, I realized it totally wasn't normal.
Walk me through just a typical day now. You, not only are you a co-host, but you're also the production manager for the show. So you've got on-air responsibilities, but you also have a lot of off-air responsibilities as well. So walk me through what a typical day at working for Elvis at Z100 was like.
Yeah, I would get in at 5 every morning, and we would start preparing any sound or anything that was coming through on the TV shows or anything we wanted to talk about. We might pitch a couple ideas to Elvis, and he decided if he wanted to throw it on the show or not. And I would work right up until it was about 5:59. And I remember I timed out the walk from my production studio to the studio where they were doing the show, and I'd put my headphones on, and I'd be on the air with them for 4 hours. But I'd also run back and forth, and I was always all hands on if there was something that needed to happen, or if there was, I don't know, if there was anything I could do to help from a production front. I never stopped. Like, I didn't just sit there and say, all right, well, I'm on the microphone now. It was, we're all in this war together today to do the show and make it sound as great as possible. So whatever I can do on any front, I'll get involved. And I liked it too. I always loved the production side of it. So it's not like it was sad for me. I liked it.
you've got back again to that all in, and you loved it all, and no job was too big or too small, which is a tremendous recipe for success. When the show was over, would you guys all get together and kind of talk about what went well, what went bad, and then prepare for the next day? What happened at 10 o'clock when the show was over for the day?
It was always, okay, what's on the next show? And we didn't have a ton of meetings off the air, or at least on a regular basis. We did have meetings from time to time, but it was, all right, back in the production studio, let's start editing, let's start doing imaging. And at that time, the network imaging was running on all stations. And so, if we had some sort of campaign where it was a listener giveaway for one of the, the national parks or whatever it was, roller coaster tour one time Elvis did, I was putting a lot of those promos together. And then I was also working with one of his producers, Josh Kolodny, and we started working in tandem on some of this stuff. And I slowly started shifting a lot of that work to him. And he's a brilliant imaging guy and a great producer. So I don't know why, but in my head, I just felt like I've got to help train some of the other people here to do this kind of work, because I just had this feeling that I wasn't going to be there forever. And so it eventually turned into, okay, I got to do whatever I have to do for the show. And I just, if I do leave, which I didn't know for sure, but I felt like at some point I was going to, I want to make sure that the people who are here, anyone who I have any sort of influence on, is going to learn as much as possible.
Which is really giving of you, not unlike what David did to you. You were returning that and teaching others to carry that torch along. And when you say that you felt like you may not be there, were you saying that because you knew at some point you wanted to go and do your own show, or there was something deep down inside that there was something else for you, or you were worried just because of the business being the business that you might get laid off?
Yeah, well, even at that time, the industry was, it's way worse now. But yeah, there'd be these stories that come out and like, oh, all these people were cut. And so I was always super confident that I would be fine there. But at some point I found out, and this is at least the story that I heard, that at some point my head was on the chopping block with budget cuts. And Elvis actually stepped in and rescued my job and started paying me through his company, which I understand it now. Like, I understand this was nothing personal. It wasn't at all. And the guys who were making these decisions, they weren't out to get me in any way. I get it. There are budget lines, and they're doing things that they need to do to keep everything afloat. But I just had this, I couldn't believe that Elvis would do that for me. Like, I knew he was really nice to me, but he rescued my job. So I thought, okay, well, it's fine for right now. What if at one point it's not? And, I just had all these kinds of thoughts, and not that they were logical, but I think they were. They were in some degrees logical.
Again, I'm really enjoying learning about your career, but also just learning about Elvis and who he is as not only a talent, but a human being. And it sounds like a tremendous person. But I get exactly what you were going through, as does, I'm sure, most people that are listening to this podcast. That is always, you're waiting for that other shoe to drop, and it's right. Scary. But you were proactive about it, which I think takes a lot of fortitude.
Yeah, and also Elvis, he at one point, because I would thank him, not even today, like when I see him, I thank him at least 15 times, and he's tired of my thank yous. Like, at one point he's like, you have to stop thanking me. He was like, please stop thanking me. And he said, he's like, listen, I didn't keep you here just to be a nice guy. It's because you're doing your job, and he liked what I was contributing to the show. So I understand that too. I do think he happens to be a really nice guy too. But I think keeping me there was because I was contributing to the show. But yeah, I didn't know what to expect next. And by the way, I still don't today. Like, every day when I open up the news in the industry, it's like, gee, what's going to happen next? What horrible thing are we going to read about our industry today? So it was always sort of in the back of my mind. And I just was aware of that, because how could you not be?
I think you're 100% correct that you cannot be. At that time, though, at Z100 and, or here in LA, I think people may have felt a little bit more protected than what maybe they were. And especially when you're part of a massive show like Elvis Duran. But the fact that you were reading those tea leaves and you were making the right preparation, it takes fortitude. And I believe a lot of people may have just stuck their head in the sand, candidly, and you did not. The opportunity now arises, and I'm excited to hear about this, to launch your own show in Boston. And I mean, that's a huge deal. You're, I'm guessing now, late 20s, early 30s.
No, I was 28.
How did that opportunity come about?
So again, Heather Cohen, I wouldn't have had that opportunity without her.
Is Heather, and I love Heather. I interviewed her a while back.
I heard it. You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. She's phenomenal, and just got to see her as well. So bright. So was she your agent at this point, or just more of a confidant?
No, she was my agent at that time.
Okay.
And we had that conversation about what I ultimately want to do. And the catalyst for it was they offered me a contract, because I was not under contract all those years with Elvis, and they offered me this contract, and I was like, wow, this is very surreal. So I went home and I read it, and I just had this moment like, I don't know if this would actually be honoring to Elvis for me to sign this, because I think I'm ready to move on. I think I'm ready to do my own show, not because I wasn't happy there. I really was. I was having a great time every day. It was awesome to work with all the people that I worked with. But I knew I'm either going to talk about doing this or I'm going to go and jump. And then also working around Elvis is always inspiring everyone. He's encouraging people to go for their dreams. And you get around that enough and you start to believe you can actually do this stuff. And so they present me with the contract and I was like, well, Elvis has been saying go for your dreams and maybe I need to do that. And I went up for an interview with CBS Radio. And it was Dan Mason Jr., who was the PD at the time. It was for 103.3 Amp Radio. It was this new station. They had converted an oldie station to this pop format. And a bunch of conversations went back and forth. And eventually they said, all right, we'd love to hire you. And I was like, wow, okay, this is interesting. So I asked Elvis if we could go to lunch. And at this point, again, like I was thinking about what's the right thing to do, and I don't know that it was the right thing to do, but I signed the contract and dropped it in the mail just so I wouldn't get convinced out of signing this deal. Because I was like, I would have done it differently if I was thinking with my head today, but I was also very afraid. And I didn't want to upset anyone. And I was just like, I just want to do the right thing. And so I don't want to make this like a negotiation. And, what a bad idea that is, right? Well, why would we want to negotiate and take advantage of this amazing opportunity that almost never comes along? But no, in all seriousness, I really knew that I wanted to jump. And I just didn't want to play games or be disrespectful. So I asked Elvis if we can go grab a bite to eat. And I sat down with him and I said, hey, I want to take this gig. I took the gig, and thank you for everything that you've done to help me to get to this point. And I said, are you okay with that? And he teared up and said, I'm so proud of you. And again, so gracious. He could have been upset. He wasn't. At least he didn't show me that he was upset. And he said, well, how do you want to exit? I said, Elvis, however you want to do it, I'm totally fine. And he said, okay, well, let's do a couple more weeks on the air. And he gave me a goodbye show and again was so gracious all the way through, which I don't know that that's normal looking back on it. Like it was normal because I was around that culture, but I don't know that it's normal looking back on it. I think it was a very kind thing that he did for me.
For sure. And you were going from an iHeart station to, it was CBS at the time. And, I think a lot of people would have handled it differently. And again, incredibly classy on his part. And that move of dropping the contract, I respect that. I get that you may have done it differently, but I would argue that it was a good thing. And we'll go more into Boston here in a minute. And it didn't, some parts of that didn't work out the way that you wanted it to work out, but it was a foundation that you needed to move to what you've accomplished today, which is so incredibly impressive. And I think you're right. I think Elvis is an absolute class act, and that part of your career was so needed because you're getting to watch such an amazing talent and show architect and being around phenomenal producers. Is Nate there, by the way, yet? Or has not?
No, I never met Nate. He came in right after I left. I met him probably close to 10 years now, and 10 years ago. And very, very nice guy from that one interaction that I had.
very bright producer as well. So you now move to Boston, and let's talk about that, because major market, but also a very formidable radio market. You've got Maddie's across the street from you, right? Is that what you guys? So you've got some big talent in that market that you've got to compete up against. And in a lot of ways, you know, Boston and in New York, they're certainly both East Coast cities, but very different and different ethos for sure. And so what was that like going from New York to Boston and now cracking the mic for the first time with your own show?
Yeah. So one of the things that Elvis really instilled in us as we started getting syndicated, there was always this battle that happened off the air about, like, you know, and I'm just talking about from an industry perspective, would a New York show work either across the country or in other cities? And Elvis always had this great answer. He said, people are people. And I carried that with me going to Boston. And it's so funny because you go to Boston, everyone's like, oh, you're from New York. And it's like, okay, you know, busting chops with the Yankees and whatever. They're just a bunch of chop busters. And we, like, once you get past all that, again, people are people. And everyone's dealing with the same kinds of things that we're dealing with in New York. They're dealing with the same things in Boston. And we made amazing friends there. And somehow, you know, people came over to our house for dinner, to my apartment. Like they were able to have a meal with me. We were able to talk about everything that we had in common. So we fit in very easily there. And actually, my dog Luna was a big catalyst for that, because we'd go out to the dog parks and we met a lot of our friends in those dog parks. But that part of it wasn't a worry. Like, am I going to be able to relate to people in Boston? It wasn't a worry for me even for a second. And also, it was funny. So I was living with my wife, Jess, in Lower Manhattan. She was my girlfriend at the time. And then we moved across the river to Brooklyn at one point. And I was living in Dumbo. And I remember it was like this really easy move. We had a moving company, move everything. We moved all the boxes. The move from Brooklyn to Boston felt exactly the same. It felt like we moved across the river. It did not feel like it was this huge shock to the system and, oh, I can't. And it's because I was with my then girlfriend, now wife, and I feel like wherever I am with her, wherever I am with my family, I just felt peace about it. And that was totally fine. So it wasn't like a huge thing to get used to. What I had to get used to was sitting in the hosting chair, because that was a whole different ballgame that I wasn't ready for.
And did you get to pick your co-hosts around you, or how was the show built?
Yeah. I worked with Lauren Ray in New York. She was also someone who started as an intern on Elvis's show, and I was a really big fan of her as a person, and I love the way she worked. And she was one of those people who just got the job done and had that same sort of drive to just work and do amazing work. And she was a really fast learner. And so she got the co-host job. And then when the show started, there was a producer who was working locally in Boston, and it just made sense to have him carry over into our show. And then at some point he decided he wanted to get out of radio. So I called up Heather Cohen and I said, hey, do you know anyone who does any sort of production or works in Boston? And she made a phone call, and then I was sitting across the table from Matt Shearer. And this is producer Matt, who's now on WBZ in Boston. Incredibly talented guy. So funny and creative. And I liked him right away. And we decided to hire him. And he's an absolute rock star. I mean, if you look up his stuff, he's just so talented. But he grew over those years and just kept blowing me away. And then eventually we felt like we needed more help, and we were able to get an assistant producer on the show. His name was Nick Benavinia. Brilliant imaging guy. I trained him up, and he had some production background, but really talented dude. And it was this great crew. We just had a big plate of production every single day, and every day it was, all right, let's meet, let's talk about the next show, let's keep, and we were just hustling every single day.
And you had a really good run. You're on for 7 years in Boston, and you're on AMP. And most of the time, are you enjoying it? You feel like things are clicking and the show's working?
I did. Yeah, I really felt like there were these awesome moments that would happen year over year over year. And ultimately, I needed to grow in so many different ways, and it allowed me the space to do that. And again, more grace. Everyone who I worked for there allowed me that space to grow, which is becoming a more and more rare thing in our industry. But if it was not for their patience and their willingness to like let me mess up and have to get my footing, there's no chance that it would have lasted that long. I mean, they were so helpful in helping me to understand how you do a show and why it's different to be in the hosting chair than the co-host chair.
And are you working, I know, was Michael Martin involved with some of the AMP stations? Who were you working with in terms of programming at that point?
So at first it was Dan, then he left
that's right.
pretty early on. Steve Salhaney, he became the program director, and I was working directly with him, and then Mark Hannon was also working as the guy in charge in that market.
And then you also went through an ownership change at that point because Intercom buys CBS to then obviously create Odyssey today. And what was that like going through that at that point? Were they relatively hands-off, or did they come in and want to make some changes?
It was pretty hands-off as far as I was concerned. We just kept rocking along, business as usual. I think you could feel there was a little bit of difference because, of course, there's different leadership that's coming in and different people are running things. But they were very kind to me the whole time. And they gave me the freedom to continue doing the show, and we continued to build the show. And it felt good to keep being able to do the show that we were doing.
How much of, and I know we talked about this earlier about you thanking Elvis, and Elvis is like, stop it, stop it, stop it. But how much of Elvis's formula do you think you, let's say, borrowed and applied to your show at AMP in Boston?
No matter what, there's going to be a part of the influence that Elvis has had on me in the way that I do things. Even today, there are things that I learned in that time that will come out still. But as far as the structure of the show, it was different because the talk breaks were shorter, and I was doing different types of things going out on the street, and I wasn't leaning so much on some of the benchmarks that we were doing in New York. We started to develop different kinds of benchmarks. So we tried to make it different. Also, like deep down, I just get bothered by copying stuff, or at least at that time, I really had a problem with it. So, now I kind of understand why people copy things, even from an artistic perspective, like why that actually matters and is a part of creating a new work. And pretty much everything is copied at this point. What is new under the sun? I don't know that anything is. But yeah, I was very conscious of that, and I wanted to make the show sound different.
Seth Godin, I think he says there's hard innovations like, Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb, or Henry Ford with the assembly line. But most inventions are soft innovations. So you're adjusting something slightly and in making it, fast food's a good example of that. Most of them are serving burgers, but they all have soft innovations. Burger King is flame broiled, and McDonald's has the Big Mac. And those soft innovations are actually what define the differences of most companies. And they can add up to be a really big deal. But in a lot of ways, the wheel is still round. It's just, we all have our different creative mark that we put on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Seth.
He's great. I love his books too. So the pandemic happens. You've now been on the air for 7 years in Boston and, doing well. You find out literally right as I think everyone's told to go work from home. Walk me through, if you don't mind, that day. And it's traumatic for most of us just because of the sheer magnitude of the pandemic and how that impacted all of our lives. But for you, it's even a bigger deal.
Yeah, it was very strange because I felt peace about the news. Like I really felt peace in every bit of my being. And, it's interesting, actually, months before that, I had this very vivid dream that this was going to happen. And I think that's God's grace giving me a little warning, but I was sort of like, I wonder what's going to happen here. We were having conversations because Boston was really the first place where the news started talking about this pandemic. And I'm looking at my wife, Jess. I'm like, is this really happening? Like literally right down the street from us? Is this the place where that conference happened? And now it's like, we're here? What is going on? And nobody knew what was going on. And it just kept getting weirder and weirder and more surreal. And we were doing the show as usual. And then at some point they said, hey, we got to set you up at home. You've got to be home. And I said, guys, I'll stay at the station. I don't want it to sound bad. I don't want it to sound bad from my living room. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment with a study, and I've got 3 kids at home and a dog and my wife. Like, where am I going to record at home? How am I going to connect to the radio station? And so finally, they go, well, you have no choice. You've got to do it. So I said, okay. So they send me home with the equipment. I hook everything up. And I had a spare bathroom. I started like taping pillows to the wall to try to get the sound to, sound halfway decent. Yeah. And we did the show and actually went off pretty well. We were all in our remote locations. It all sounded good. And then after that show, it was the first show from home. I got a phone call from the guys that I was working for in Boston, and they said, unfortunately, the decision's been made and we have to terminate the show. And they were so nice about it. I don't think that they wanted this to happen. But like a lot of shows, I wasn't alone in this. The show was just unplugged. And I said, guys, listen, I appreciate you. Thank you for the opportunity you've given me. And I was genuine. I was only grateful for the opportunity they gave me, and it was time to close this chapter. And they said, listen, I don't know if you want to do a goodbye show or not. And I said, yeah, I would love to. And they said, okay, great. So come in tomorrow. So then I was back at the studio, and we were now in different rooms, which I was like, this is what I wanted to do in the first place. I just wanted to be in the different rooms here at the studio, so it sounded good. And we took phone calls. So this was when everyone was stuck in their apartments. The city had been locked down, I think, at that point. Or at the very least, there was no one on the roads. Everyone was inside. And our phones did not stop ringing all morning. It was phone call after phone call after phone call. I took calls for 4 hours with people saying, I can't believe this is happening. What's happening in the world? And I just thanked the audience, and I said, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I only took a couple breaks for run into the bathroom. We played a couple songs. And at the end of the show, I went down to my boss, Steve Salhani's office, and I said, see, this is the show that I wanted to do. The more talk, less music. That was the show. We were laughing and having a great time. But it was actually really fun, aside from the fact that we were all losing our gigs, to just take phone calls and talk to people and hear their stories, hear what they were experiencing.
3 quick observations. 1, so classy on Odyssey's part to let you do that.
100%. They were fantastic. They fired me in the nicest way possible.
Actually, this is 1A to that. Cumulus just did the same thing with Lamont and Tonelli, which I thought was very nice at the Bone in San Francisco. And so they were able to have a send-off show. So I think that's a classy move. And I feel like we don't do enough of that in this industry. And so I like to see that, because it's already really shitty to lose your gig. And then just for one day, your listeners have no idea where you went, and you've got this connection that you've spent 7 years building. And I think it's a nice way to at least be able to say goodbye and to mourn. In a lot of ways, it's almost like a death. You're mourning something that you've put so much effort and so much time into,
And the reason why that happened is I have to credit Steve Salhani and Mark Hannon. They trusted me, and they knew that I wasn't going to do anything on the air that would get anyone in trouble. And it was because we had a relationship. They would take the time to meet with me. They would take the time to discuss ideas. They would take the time to care enough. I think it's amazing. I don't know if you know Steve Salhani or not. He's like the boss in Spider-Man who yells at Peter Parker, "Parker, get out of here!" But the guy has an incredible heart, and there were multiple times over those years where you knew it was for real. Like, he actually cared about me. Like, we went through a really tough time. I lost a baby with my wife Jess, and like the care that he specifically, and Mark Hannon, there was real relationship there, and they knew that if they let me do the show, it was going to be fine. And so, I bring that up for a reason, because I think a lot of times relationship is lost in a lot of companies where these are just people who are employees and no one really cares. And so I think you're seeing the fruit of no one really caring in a lot of different spaces in the industry right now. And if that changed, if people actually cared, I think the industry would look totally different.
It is so well said. Thank you for saying that. The second observation, I want to first play something that you sent me, and I thought it was absolutely amazing. You had your daughter break to your mother that you had lost your job and recorded it. And I found it absolutely brilliant on a creative level. And I found it as humorous as you could possibly be about having something so, I don't want to say tragic, but losing a gig can be very terrible. And it can feel like a death. It can feel incredibly anxiety inducing, especially in the midst of early days of a pandemic. But let's play that.
Hello?
Hey, Mom, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Well, I got fired today.
What?
Yep.
What? Are you serious?
Yeah, but I'm totally fine.
They fired you?
No, I'm fine, though.
Oh,
Grandma, Daddy got fired today.
Oh, I'm so sorry. How are you, Charlie?
Good. How does it make you feel that your son doesn't have a job?
Oh, my God. Oh, Charlie, I feel bad for him.
Are you happy that he lost his job?
No, I'm sad that he lost it. What
Well,
did you say?
his bank account is not happy.
Oh, his bank account's not happy? I'm sure it's not. My goodness.
We might have to live off candy for a while.
No. Oh, boy.
Did you ever get fired from your job?
No, I never got fired from a job, but Grandpa did.
What did Grandpa do?
I don't know. I don't know what he did.
Did he fart in the coffee room? I would fire him if I was his boss.
you know, you're too much.
Why are you laughing when Dada just lost his job?
Oh, well, I'm not laughing at Dad losing his job. I'm laughing at
Sure sounds like it.
No,
He'll get another show.
he'll get another show. Daddy's talented, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you learn to cope with something of such a severity and be so calm about it? Not only calm about it, but have a sense of humor about it.
Well, I don't know if this is the answer you want, but it's one word, Chachi. Jesus.
Is it really?
Yeah, that's it.
Good for you, man. Did you grow up religious? Was that something that your parents instilled?
So we went to the Catholic Church, and it was just a part of the thing that you did. I didn't really understand it or understand why I was there. But at one point, I was in New York, and I felt like I was going to be happy when I got to the position that I got to, when I was making the money that I was making. And I felt empty when I got there. And so I went home to my apartment one night. I got on my knees. My dad is a believer, and my mom, they both are still today. And, it was kind of ringing in the back of my head, like, man, I'm so unhappy. Let me pray. And so I prayed for a wife. And I asked for a woman that I could love more and more every day, someone that I could start a family with, someone that would bring me closer to him. And it just happened. So, you use the word religious. To me, that doesn't align with what I believe. It's like I'm on this adventure about this thing that is the center of our existence. And I really believe that. And this real peace for the first time in my life comes with that.
The spirituality, is it safe to call it that, would you say? The spirituality, I think the way that you handle that, and the audio we just heard of your adorable daughter talking to your mom, is such a healthy way of handling something like losing your job. And I think a lot of people would be really angry about it. A lot of people, to your point, wouldn't be able to be on the air the next day because the management would be scared about what they would say and so forth. And you handled it like such a classy human being. And I found that really impressive. And I found that to be beyond you're a young guy, and you're still a very young guy, beyond your years in wisdom. I think that, and I mean this, as a compliment, it just was handled like someone that had a lot of education in therapy or whatever it may be. And now that you share Jesus and spirituality, that makes a lot of sense to me, and appreciate you answering that.
Well, there's an interesting shift that happened in Boston where early on in Boston, my whole identity was wrapped up in how successful am I on the radio? And at a certain point that shifted, and I realized that is not what defines me as a person. I believe that I am defined by my relationship with Jesus. And when that became my reality, you can take a job away from me, you can pay me less money, you can call me names, whatever you want. It's okay. I am not living for what my status is on the radio anymore, and that's freeing. And what's interesting about that is it actually gives me this freedom to be creative that I didn't have before. So I felt like there was a cap on how creative I could be. There's now this freedom because I'm not worried about all that stuff. And that's an amazing gift.
It really is an amazing gift. It has served you incredibly well, and I appreciate you sharing that audio with me and let me play it again because I absolutely loved it. And your daughter is just a phenomenal performer, and your mom is, I love your mom, man. She's fantastic. The third part, was that then motivation to build what you've now created, which is the TJ show, and I'm really excited to dive into this part about it. Now on 75 radio stations around the country. Did that stem from losing your job, or how did you find the motivation within to build and start anew?
So I actually didn't think that radio had a place for me anymore, Chachi. I was convinced that this was, I guess, 2020, this current state of affairs in our industry just doesn't have a place for me. I'm not going to find something that works. And I was convinced of that. And what's amazing is during that time, I received phone calls from most of the top 10 markets, and they said, hey, we want to do a show or some version of that. And I'd say, okay, well, what are the resources? What are you guys providing for the staff? Because I really feel like we've got to do this as a team if we're going to win and if we're going to even have a chance at competing in this environment that we're in. And it would always be some version of, well, it's going to be you as the host. We'll have a co-host that does all your social media. And the worst of what I heard was, and we've got a shared producer for you. And I said, well, what's a shared producer? They said, well, this is a producer who's producing 3 different shows at once in our building. And I said, how is that working out for you guys? And there was just this pause in the line. He said, listen, I know what you're asking. It's not ideal. So I didn't want to get involved if we weren't going to be able to really do a show. And I think there's other ways to do a show, different kinds of show. But if you're trying to win in a morning slot in major cities, how do you do that without people? This is a group effort. So these conversations kept fizzling out. And I got a phone call shortly after, actually got a really big phone call about something in New York at that time. And it was surreal. I was like, wait, what? They're considering me for this? Are you kidding me? And it just didn't feel right to me. And again, that conversation fizzled out and that station flipped shortly after. And so I'm grateful that I didn't jump into that. I got a phone call in, I think it was February of 2022. And it was from Charles Steinhauer. And he said, hey, we're starting this thing. And we think that there's space for a syndicated radio show. And I said, great, well, what are the resources? And he said, you tell me, what do you think you need? And I said, well, here's what I think we need to really do a show in the right way. And he said, okay, cool, we can do it. And so that felt like, is this real? Really? Okay, so we went and grabbed a bite to eat, and I said, no, I'm really serious. I think this is what we need to do a show, and here's the vision for it. He said, yeah, I think that's great. And I had known Charles for a bunch of years. I met him at a talkers conference, and I think it was 2008. And he's been sporadically in touch over the years and has always been very supportive of my work. And so I heard about this project with Gemini 13 and what they were doing, and it all sounded very intriguing. And it was like, man, the timing on this is really good for where we're at. And so I talked it over with my wife, Jess, and we decided, okay, this is cool. Let's see where this goes. And one thing led to the next, and that's how we got to this show that we're doing today.
Couple things. Charles, one of the brightest minds
So
in
smart.
the business, incredibly bright. And Spencer, the other co-founder of Gemini 13, founder of Dial Global and Cadence 13. I mean, very, very bright guys. They pulled in Scotty Myers, who I revere as, I don't think it gets any better in terms of affiliate
Incredible.
groups on the planet. He's been so gracious with his time, and I've learned a tremendous amount from both Charles and Scotty. But when I found out that Scotty was going to be involved in this project, because Scotty had worked for Tesh for 20 years. I mean, he'd been with John for a long time. And so for them to have that kind of belief in you is really profound, because they collectively know the business very, very well. And the other observation here, I think a lot of people would have taken a lot of those top 10 market jobs that you were offered and made the sacrifice of having to share a producer. But the fact that you went for, I think my monkey math, for a year and a half without a job, but you really were very true to yourself and what you felt needed to happen to have a successful show, also says a lot, that you are a true believer, A, in yourself, but B, in putting out a quality product and not making a sacrifice when it comes to what goes over the air. And I commend you for that.
Well, thanks. But it's like, how do you stand out with a radio show today with all of the different media options that people have? Like, you better be all in and firing on all cylinders. Or do you have even a slight shot? Like, look around the industry, some of these shows, and I'm sad to see it, but some of these shows that they hired instead of me at that time, I don't know that most of them are still there. You know, and it's like, that's a pretty small chance that you've given these people to really develop something. Why do we keep getting in this cycle where it's like, okay, let's put on a show, we'll give them whatever resources we have, and we'll just hope it works? Like, does it ever just by accident work, Chachi? You've been doing this for a very long time. From my years of observation, it's very rare, if ever.
It would have to be lightning in a bottle, especially because not only are you not, unfortunately, getting the resources that you need at the market, in the studio in terms of your producers and production and so forth, but also you're not getting the marketing dollars. You know, my mentor, I've had several, but one of my biggest mentors was Johnny Kay, and he told me a profound figure back in the 80s when Cox Communications owned Coast. They spent $4 million a year in television marketing. $4 million a year. And so you were seeing Coast billboards, Coast bus boards, Coast commercials all over the place. And a lot of people, because they were so many and there was the frequency was so intense, thought that Dick Clark actually owned the radio station because he was the spokesperson for Coast. And Johnny told me the story that he completely lost his mind at management when they cut his marketing from $4 million to $3 million a year. And that was the type of weight that you had to put against a schedule to build a new morning show, to build, at the time, Mark and Kim. And unfortunately, no talent that I'm aware of on the radio is given that kind of marketing. And I don't blame the industry. It's completely different economics. But I would argue that we don't give any of our talent, or very few of our talent, enough of the marketing and the promotion that they need to be able to make an impact in a market.
But here's a question about that. Do you really think the marketing is going to be the thing that gets a show on the map in today's environment?
I think that you need both. I think that you have to have a great radio show, a great program. But I also feel that it's empty if you have the marketing without the product. Right. And it's not that a great product can't. Here, I just read this the other day. Tesla has never spent $1, to my understanding, in marketing. They do not buy traditional radio, TV, social media ads like Ford or General Motors does. You can argue, I think successfully, that is a great product, and it is a brand that people have an affinity for, that's what I'm looking to say. However, they have a CEO who earns a tremendous amount of earned media, because anytime Elon Musk says anything, it's going to get picked up in the news. And so I think it's hard if you were Elvis Duran is going to pick up earned media because he's Elvis Duran. But for a brand new show starting out, no matter how good it is, it's very hard to grow that show, in my opinion, without having some marketing behind it.
No, I definitely agree with you that it's hard to build anything new, but with time and consistency, and I think with the talent, which I know our industry loves to talk about, hire the right talent. And it's like, well, can we think about the current reality of our industry right now? So let's say there's a radio station in some town and they've got a budget for mornings and a budget for afternoons. Well, what does that look like? Like, how much money do you have in those 2 day parts? What if you rethought it and you were like, okay, well, what if we combine those two? We figure, and I'm not saying this like, pick our show for your afternoon syndication or your morning syndication, but find some show that can hold down that slot in this current reality. And what if you combine the budget you do have for your air talent and really built this local show that you keep talking about? How much would that change the game for so many radio stations? I feel like everyone's trying to get by on these thin budgets in every day part. And it's like, all right, well, it'd be nice if we had a budget in every day part, but can we combine it and do one show right and give the team members the resources they need to actually do a radio show in this world that we're in?
I think that's a very compelling argument. And I just came from Forecast, and a lot of the conversation at Forecast is being live and being local. And I think you've got a lot of broadcasters that are successful doing that. Connoisseur, who's in your backyard, they do a really good job with that. And I know that Town Square does a very good job with that, and Saga does a very good job with that. But I would also argue that what you're saying makes a tremendous amount of sense. I'd rather have one really great show as opposed to a handful of mediocre shows. And I don't even want to call them mediocre, but just resource light shows that don't have the resources to be able to do what they need to do, or they're tracking multiple stations and or doing 4 or 5 gigs at the radio station. And I think I think what you are presenting makes a tremendous amount of sense.
Well, it's like also, how much can these new shows, like how much can you let them fail? How many times are we going to try the same thing in this industry and be like, it's a different time. You used to be able to do it. When it was the 80s, it was different. In the 90s, it was it. It's like we have to strategize for today. We have to rethink the way that we're pursuing these radio stations. The current reality is what it is. So how do we adjust and move? There's that book. One of the first books that I ever read in the business world was Who Moved My Cheese? And it actually was recommended by Tom Pullman. And it's like, we are in the most Who Moved My Cheese decade, or multiple decades, that we could possibly be in. Like, should we start thinking about moving with the cheese?
It's a great book and great analogy. You're absolutely right. And I think that I know that your show is a testament to syndication can work if syndication is done right and you put out a phenomenal product. And to watch this rocket ship, and I know I brought that up earlier, take off like it has been really enjoyable. We don't participate in any of it, and but I couldn't be any happier because obviously I know the people involved, and I'm so happy to see you have success, and Scotty and the guys over at Gemini, and ultimately I'm excited to see the industry do so well with this. But to go from effectively 0 stations to now 75 in literally 2 years' time I can't name another show that has taken off at that clip. At least since I've been in the business. Is this something that you felt right away, or when did you know that you had a hit on your hand?
Well, I didn't know that we'd get one station early on, and I mean that. Again, it's Scotty making phone calls, and we had that first agreement in Key West that came through. It was Buddy Shula. And he said, all right, I like what you guys are doing. Before he'd even heard the show, it was just demo audio. He jumped at it and said, we'll run it. And that started to steamroll some confidence. You just named a lot of people there. This is the product of a team working really well together, both on the air and off the air. My team on the air, they're incredibly talented, every one of them in what they do. There's no chance this show would be where it is if it wasn't for Jabo and Kenny, producer Heather, camera guy Josh. Like, this is a group effort. Everyone's all in, and everyone's got that all in mentality. So I think when we're all on the same page and we're firing on all cylinders like we've been talking about, I'm not surprised that it's working. But no, did I just think right from the start, this is going to be a hit? No. And I'm still like, in my head, I don't see it as a hit. I'm just like, we got to do the next show. Right now, I'm just thinking about what am I doing on tomorrow's show?
How did you discover J-Bo, Kenny, Heather, and camera guy Josh? Were they all friends of yours? Did they work with you in Boston, or how did the show come to be?
So when we started getting to a co-host conversation, they said, well, who do you want to work with? And I wasn't really familiar with the landscape, so I went to market number 1 on All Access at the time, and I went through and said, let me hear who's out there. And I just started listening from the top station down the list. Then I went to market number 2, and I just kept going 3, 4, and just what I started to realize as we got lower and lower on the market list was that a lot of stations were running tons of syndicated programming. And I didn't realize it was like, oh, wow, this not only are they running these shows, but the websites look exactly the same and they're different companies. Like, it was just really wild to go through that process. But I got down to, I think, market 100 something. And I was just doing this a little bit at a time, every day. This became my job. It was, we're going to find who's out there. And I had a short list of 3 people who I thought would be a great co-host. And J-Bo was there on that list. And I got to know her. I got to meet her. And I really liked her. I like her as a person. I like what she does on the air. She's got a comic mindset where she's very quick and can roll with whatever is happening in the moment. Producer Kenny had the same start as me at Fairleigh Dickinson University. He worked with the same guys that I worked with, and I've known him over the years. He worked with me in Boston as an assistant producer at the time. He was working with me from a distance. He was actually in New Jersey while we were up in Boston, and he would go out and record stuff at Yankee Stadium, send it to me, and then we'd be running stuff from the Bronx in Boston, and a bunch of whole other things. If there was something at the Rockefeller Center, he would go out, get audio at Rockefeller Center and start asking people, do you feel bad about this tree? Like, the thing is dead now and we're just sitting here, and so it was really cool. It felt very exciting. I do feel bad for that tree, by the way. Yeah, but it was very exciting for me to have a liaison in the New York area, because I always was like, man, I would love to have this show be expanded at some point. And so to me, it was kind of a way to start doing that before we were actually syndicated. So Kenny would be in touch all the time. And then, so producer Heather has worked in the industry for a number of years. She came highly recommended through Charles and a number of the folks at Gemini 13. She's an amazing producer. She's just one of these radio people, just has a makeup to be in the industry. Love working with her. And camera guy Josh, I met at a charity event. We were sitting down waiting for it to start, and we happened to be at the same table. He was a school teacher, but he had started a video production company, and he was doing weddings and really had a passion for video. And somebody introduced us, and he said, wait, so you work in radio? Do you know, I'm trying to buy a microphone. Do you have any suggestions for this application? And I was like, oh yeah, you know what? Look up the MKE 600. It's a great mic. I just started using it. And we stayed in touch. And then I was like, hey, would you ever want to do something? At this time, I wasn't on the air yet. I said, would you ever want to film something for the podcast that I'm doing? And what would you charge me for that? And he's like, I'll just do it for free. I just want to get the experience. And he had that go-getter, I want to make this work at all costs mentality that we keep talking about. And I just recognized it right away. So when this opportunity came up, we had this position for someone to do video. He was the first guy I thought of. And I said, Josh, I don't know if you want to leave being a school teacher or not. He's like, yes, absolutely. And so he's been our guy who's responsible for a lot of the social media videos. And also, I don't know very much about what makes a social media video work. Like, I know how to do a certain level of video production, but I'm pretty limited. I'm mostly focused on audio. The big hits that we've had with social media at this point, the stories where there was a video that went up for I think it went up to 60 million views. I mean, totally insane. I would have never even posted the video because I didn't think it was all that special. But he's just been consistent with cutting up these clips and day in and day out, finding these angles. So like I said, it's a group effort. It's a teamwork story. And I'm very grateful for every single one of them.
It goes to show you that you can build something in this modern era and literally take it from scratch, from the ingredients. And my kudos to you and to Charles and Spencer and Scotty and your entire team for building a brand new show and putting together the right pieces. And thank you for breaking down everyone's background. And it sounds like you went to a lot of trouble to put together this great team, that it can work. And not only can it work, but you can go on to have tremendous success. And that warms my heart in a lot of ways, because you are doing something obviously very compelling that is resonating with an audience and listeners all around this country. And you just a handful of weeks ago had the first pop-up station, and you're back on the air right now in New York. And tell everyone a little bit about that and how you are back on the air and actually have your own branded radio station.
Well, I got a phone call, and it was Charles, and he's like, "I've got a curveball here." I said, "Huh?" He said, "We have."
By
this
the way, when
opportunity."
I worked with Charles, those curveballs just weren't always a lot of fun. But I'm glad this was a good curveball.
Yeah. And he's like, "I know you've always wanted to be on the radio in New York, and I think that's going to happen." And I'm thinking like, "Oh, is he talking about our station in Albany, New York? You know, or what is he talking about?" And he told me the whole story about the timing and how there was an opportunity to provide programming for WEPN. And I was like, "Is this real life? Really? You want to run us in the morning and in the afternoon?" So they're running the show twice a day, and it is a blast. We're having a great time. My mom gets to tune in now on her way to work. My dad is listening to the show because he doesn't want to bother with podcasts. So, we weren't on locally. And he called me. He's like, "The show sounds really good." I was like, "Thanks, Dad." I'm glad you're liking the show. And it's pretty surreal. I don't know that that's ever happened before. I mean, I know there have been these flash stations that have come on, but it's pretty exciting to have this opportunity for however long it lasts. I'm grateful for it, and I just want to keep doing a great show.
And you're on an MS station, one of the unfortunately the last, because I think there are no finer broadcasters than MS Communications, and to be able to work with Jeff Simulian and Rick Cummings, it doesn't get any better than that. And I know a bit about that story, and I think you guys had about a week and a half to put that whole station on the air and to do what you did in such a quick turnaround. And I was just there and got to listen to it. Sounds amazing, man. And I'm sure
thanks.
It gives your mom and you and your family and friends goosebumps to be able to have your own station in New York hopefully for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping it stays on for a while. But yeah, we did. We had a week and a half to pull it together, and so it was actually really fun because I got to pitch in a little bit on the imaging, which I don't have an excuse to do a ton of imaging anymore. But it was a wild week and a half where my wife, Jess, had just happened to be away on vacation with our girls at the time. And thank God it timed out that way, because I would wake up, do the show, and then go home and produce imaging and figure out whatever it is that we had to do. And it was like 18-hour days, Chachi. It was every single day I thought I went overboard in New York, but this was like a whole nother level. But it was really exciting too. And I was very happy to be able to do it, because who gets this opportunity? This is so cool. To be on against your mentor, Elvis Duran, in the same market. What just an incredible experience, man. I'm really happy for you. And it's been incredible getting to know you better. Congratulations on all your success. I've got one last bonus question, if you got an extra minute here for you. But sure.
Given your history and coming up through a college radio station, what advice would you give to radio people and young people in general that are wondering about the future in terms of our industry?
Man, I wish I knew the exact right direction to encourage someone to go in. But I think if you focus on your craft and you're willing to get sharper and sharper as a performer, there's going to be a place for you if your work gets good enough. And that only comes with time and pouring into every detail that you can. Does it have to be on the radio? I love being in a radio studio. I'm very fortunate that I was able to start at a time where I was able to get into a radio studio and be able to stay in a radio studio for the most part of 24 years at this point. But I don't know that it's such a bad idea to have a great YouTube channel or use one of these other delivery systems or podcasting. There's so many creative, interesting things that we can do today. But it starts with the willingness and the discipline to get good at the craft. So I think that there will be opportunities in radio. My hope is that there's this cycle that happens and like someone wakes up. And I know that there are really great programmers out there that do care about building up the next generation of talent. And I actually didn't know that before we started this project. Through this project, through meeting some of the programmers that are running the stations that we're on, there are some amazing people that still care about radio, care about the people in it, and want to find those young and up-and-coming talents. And is it getting more and more rare? Probably. I mean, definitely. But they're out there. And so there are opportunities for those who rise to the top and rise to the occasion and the opportunity.
I love that, man. That is a phenomenal answer and a great piece of advice. You have absolutely honed in your skill set and put out a phenomenal product every single day. My congratulations to you. And I thank you, TJ, for everything you do for the industry and inspiring everybody else.
Hello.
Hello, Grandma. It's 2023.
Yeah. How are you, Charlie Jean?
Guess what? Dada got hired today.
He got hired?
Yup.
You're kidding. He's hired?
How does it make you feel that your son has a job?
It makes me feel great. I'm happy for my son.
You feel great that Dada won't be able to hang out with us anymore?
Well, no, that's kind of sad.
That's a terrible thing, Grandma.
Oh, sorry. I don't mean it that way, but if she said our son got hired. Charlie Jean.
Wow.
Lollipops for dinner can't last forever.
How do you feel about that has a job?
We're gonna try to hit him up for an iPad.
Thank you so much, Chachi. I really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing with this podcast. I know you do so much more than this podcast, but just focusing on this that you're doing, I hope you are inspired to continue doing these episodes and continue to talk to the industry leaders that you know and that you've built relationships with over the years, because I think the industry needs to hear these conversations, and you're doing such a great job. Your episodes have inspired me multiple times over. I've shared them with people. I've talked to some of my dear friends in the industry. I first discovered the podcast through my friend Edgar Sotelo, who I love, and you interviewed him. I feel like this whole world was opened up to me, and I appreciate everything that you're doing with this podcast.
Thank you, man. You made my day. Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends.
Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
This has been a Benztown McVeigh podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Executive producer, Darren Silva. Producer and editor, Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator, Estefania Padilla. Marketing and distribution, Suzanne Aksu and Robbie Gessel.